It happened so fast, no one had time to breathe. One moment, the chemistry lab was filled with the usual sounds of teenagers talking and shifting around, the scent of chemicals in the air as experiments took place. The next, Dylan Ross had his hand wrapped tightly around Miss Naomi Harris's throat, slamming her against the counter. The glass beakers rattled and gas hissed from an open valve. Students froze in shock, some fumbling for their phones, unsure whether this was real or a joke. But Miss Harris, she didn't flinch. She didn't scream for help. Her black eyes locked on Dylan with calm precision, steady, unshaken. She wasn't afraid. It was as if she'd faced far worse threats than this and knew exactly how to deal with them. And in the next 5 seconds, what happened would not only change Dylan's life, but turn the school upside down. The morning sun slipped weakly through the tall glass windows of Westbrook High, casting a dull light on the hallways as students shuffled in. Conversations buzzed softly in the background. It seemed like any other ordinary school day. The same cycle of classes and assignments, the same teenage gossip. But on the second floor, inside the chemistry lab, something was about to happen that none of them would ever forget. A chain of events that would ruin reputations, shatter arrogance, and reveal the startling hidden past of a woman who, until that moment, appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary teacher. Her name was Miss Naomi Harris. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed and poised. The new chemistry teacher commanding silence the moment she entered the room. She wasn't young, fresh out of college, nor was she old. She was the perfect blend of authority and mystery. Her posture was always perfect, even in summer, with long sleeves covering her arms. Some students whispered that she was strict. Others said she was cold, distant, even lonely. A few rumors suggested she had lived another life before Westbrook High, one no one seemed to know much about. What none of them realized was that these rumors weren't as far-fetched as they seemed. Then there was Dylan Ross. Every school has one. The bully. The student who thinks he's untouchable. He walks the halls like he owns them. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a smug grin that could make anyone feel inferior. Dylan Ross was the son of a wealthy businessman who practically owned half the city, and he acted like it. He mocked weaker students, shoved kids into lockers, and cheated on tests without fear of consequences. Teachers tolerated him or looked the other way because they didn't want to risk crossing his father's influence. But Miss Harris, she was different. She didn't flinch when he mocked her lessons. She didn't cower when he raised his voice. Instead, she met him with a sharp, unwavering gaze that made him feel uneasy for the first time in his life. And Dylan hated feeling uneasy. That's when things started to spiral out of control. Dylan leaned lazily against his workstation at the back of the room, arms crossed. His friends snickered beside him, feeding off his bravado. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals as the class worked through their experiments. Dylan smirked, raising his voice so everyone could hear. Dylan: "Hey, Miss Harris, are you really a teacher, or just playing dress-up to cover the rent?" The room responded with nervous laughter, the usual reaction to Dylan's mockery. It was a game for him. Provoke, humiliate, and see who would break. Miss Harris didn't flinch. Without even looking his way, she spoke with a tone so calm it cut through the tension. "Miss Harris, focus on your experiment. Dylan, your solution is about to overheat." It wasn't the response he was expecting. Dylan's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being dismissed like this. Normally, teachers stumbled, stammered, or gave in, but Miss Harris shut him down with one simple sentence. Dylan was irritated, his pride wounded. "Dylan, don't tell me what to do," he snapped, his voice louder now. "You're not my boss. My dad pays your salary. Now, let me ask you, have you ever seen someone so drunk on power that they thought their money made them untouchable? How would you respond if you were Miss Harris in this situation? If you believe no amount of wealth should ever excuse arrogance, smash that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this." The tension in the room was palpable as Dylan's words hung in the air. For a brief moment there was silence. His friends exchanged glances, trying to suppress their smiles. The rest of the class shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how this would play out. It was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment when the teacher would either cower or fight back. But Miss Harris didn't flinch. She didn't even seem to be fazed. Her eyes, however, remained locked on Dylan's, piercing and unwavering, the quiet power behind them stronger than any words she could speak. Dylan's bravado seemed to falter for a second, but it was quickly replaced by that same arrogant smirk. "Dylan, you heard me, right?" He took a step closer to her, his voice growing louder, more condescending. "I don't take orders from you. You're just a teacher. My dad's the one who keeps this school running. You think you can boss me around?" His words cut through the room, but Miss Harris's gaze never wavered. There was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation in her posture. She was a statue in the storm, unmovable, as if the world around her could crash down and she would still stand tall. "Miss Harris." "Dylan," she said evenly, her voice a low but firm command. "You might believe your father's money controls this school, but in this classroom, science and discipline rule. And right now, I'm asking you to sit down and focus on your work." Her words were calm, deliberate, and when she spoke, it was clear that she wasn't going to engage in a battle of egos. There was no shouting, no anger, just a simple direct request. But that's when it happened. The moment Dylan knew he had to prove he was the one in charge. His grip on his power, his arrogance, couldn't let her dismiss him like this. The room was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation and the occasional clink of glass. Dylan's friends snickered, urging him on with nervous glances, the crowd waiting for the explosion they knew was coming. "Dylan, what did you just say?" he asked, his voice now laced with an edge. He stepped closer, his hands now balled into fists at his sides. His friends laughed softly, egging him on, but Miss Harris remained unbothered. The quiet confidence in her presence was starting to break Dylan's resolve. He was used to people fearing him, bending to his will. Teachers, students, anyone. But Miss Harris was different. She wasn't intimidated by him. And that was the last thing Dylan could tolerate. "Dylan, you think you can talk to me like that? Who the hell do you think you are?" His words were sharp, but Miss Harris wasn't fazed. Her gaze never faltered and she didn't step back. She stood her ground, as still as a mountain, and in that moment she became something far more than just a teacher. She was the one in control. "Miss Harris, I think you're about to learn what happens when you underestimate people." The finality of her words sent a ripple of tension through the room. Dylan sneered and took another step forward, his face red with frustration. His eyes scanned her, looking for a crack in her composure. Something, anything, that would give him the advantage. "Dylan, or what?" he demanded, now standing so close that his breath hit her face. "What are you going to do about it?" There was a brief, deafening silence in the air. And then Miss Harris spoke again, her voice a low whisper. But it was a whisper that carried the weight of everything she had ever lived through, everything she had ever endured. It was a voice that made Dylan pause for the first time in his life. "Miss Harris, you don't know who you're dealing with." At that moment, something in Dylan's mind snapped. He didn't understand it at first, but he would soon learn that the teacher in front of him was far more than just a simple educator. What he didn't know was that he was about to face something far more dangerous than his money or his ego could ever protect him. From Dylan was beyond the point of no return. Miss Harris's calm, unwavering demeanor only fueled his rage. His hands were balled into fists and his jaw clenched tight as he looked down at her. For the first time he could feel the pressure mounting. It was like the world was shifting, and he was being forced into a corner, a place he had never been before. But Dylan wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. His pride, the shield he'd carried for years, was cracking under the weight of her steady gaze. Dylan took another step closer, his chest puffed out, determined to remind her who he was. "Dylan, you really think you can just talk to me like that?" His voice was now trembling with a mix of frustration and something else. Fear. But he wouldn't let anyone see that. He would never show weakness. He had to show Miss Harris that he was in charge. He had to prove that she couldn't just ignore him. Miss Harris didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her posture remained perfect, calm, unbothered. But the tension in the air was thick, suffocating. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. And then Dylan did it. He crossed the line. With a sudden movement, he lunged forward, grabbing Miss Harris by the throat and slamming her against the counter. The room went completely silent. The sound of Dylan's breath, heavy and uneven, filled the space as he tightened his grip. His classmates were frozen, unable to look away, some shocked into silence, others too afraid to move. A few fumbled with their phones, trying to catch the moment. Dylan, "What now, huh?" He sneered, his grip tightening around her throat. His voice dripped with cruel satisfaction. "What are you going to do now?" For a heartbeat, time stood still. The sound of the gas leaking from the open valve seemed distant, like it was coming from another world. The beakers on the counter rattled, but all that mattered was Dylan's face, twisted with anger, smug in his belief that Miss Harris was powerless against him. He was the one with the power now. Or so he thought, but Miss Harris's eyes never left his. There was no fear, no panic, nothing that suggested she was in danger. In fact, it was as if she had been waiting for this very moment. She wasn't shocked by the aggression. She wasn't surprised. She had seen worse, been through worse, and in that moment everything changed. With lightning speed, Miss Harris's hand shot up, grabbing Dylan's wrist with an iron grip that made him flinch. His smirk faltered. His breath hitched as he realized something was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He should have been the one in control. He should have been the one standing victorious. But now, his wrist was locked in place, her fingers digging into him with a force that made his muscles scream in protest. "Miss Harris, you think you're in control here?" She whispered, her voice low, steady. But there was something dangerous in it, something that cut through the arrogance in Dylan's eyes. "You're not." Before Dylan could react, Miss Harris twisted his arm, her other hand striking his elbow with terrifying precision. The pain was instant, shooting through his arm like fire. He let out a strangled cry, his hold on her loosening. "Dylan, what the hell?" he gasped, but it was too late. Miss Harris spun behind him, locking his arm behind his back with ease. The room stood still. Students who had once feared Dylan, who had seen him bully and dominate without consequence, now saw him as nothing more than prey. Dylan's body slammed against the counter with a resounding thud, the sound echoing through the lab. He tried to fight, but Miss Harris's grip only tightened. The harder he struggled, the tighter she held him. And then, in a voice that sent a chill down his spine, Miss Harris whispered once more, "Miss Harris, apologize." Her tone was low, but it carried a weight of authority Dylan had never experienced before. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Dylan, trembling with fear and pain, groaned, unable to move. His once cocky demeanor was gone, replaced with a raw desperation. "Dylan, I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking as he spoke. For the first time in his life, Dylan Ross was no longer the one in control. His arrogance had been shattered in a matter of seconds by a woman he had underestimated. A woman who had been more than just a teacher. Miss Harris. "Good," she said, releasing her grip and pushing him forward. Dylan stumbled, clutching his arm, his face pale and humiliated. The class remained silent. No one dared laugh. No one dared speak. They had witnessed something far greater than just a teacher standing up to a bully. They had witnessed the dismantling of someone who believed they could never be touched, brought down by the very person he had underestimated. Dylan stumbled back, his body still reeling from the force of Miss Harris's grip, his breath shallow and rapid as he tried to steady himself. The entire class was frozen, their eyes wide, mouths agape. No one had ever seen Dylan like this, humbled, broken, and utterly powerless. He was no longer the untouchable bully who ruled the halls of Westbrook High. In that moment, he was just a frightened teenager who had crossed the line with the wrong person. Miss Harris stood tall, her posture as perfect as ever, not a single sign of exertion on her face. She had done what none of the teachers at this school had dared to do. She had taken control. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't threatened. She had simply done what was necessary, and it had been enough to dismantle everything Dylan had built. The silence in the room was deafening. The usual classroom noises, the scribbling of pens, the shifting of students in their seats, had vanished. All that could be heard was the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the faint hiss of gas from the open valve, and then, in a move that seemed almost too calm, Miss Harris adjusted the cuffs of her blouse, as if the moment had been nothing more than a slight interruption. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes, those eyes that had once been unyielding, now held something different. There was a flicker of something darker in them, something none of the students had seen before. a storm that had been held in check for far too long. Miss Harris. Class dismissed. Her voice was firm, but it carried an air of finality, like a judge handing down a sentence. It wasn't an angry command. It wasn't even a victory speech. It was simply the way she asserted control, and everyone in the room knew better than to argue. The students sat frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do, their minds still processing what had just happened. One by one, they began to gather their books and slip out of the room. No one spoke. No one made a sound. Their glances darted nervously between Miss Harris and Dylan, who was still clutching his arm, his face pale and humiliated. Some avoided looking at him altogether, unsure how to process the drastic shift in power they had just witnessed. Dylan stood there, frozen in place, his mind racing. He had been the king of Westbrook High for years, untouchable, invincible, with a sense of entitlement so ingrained that he had never once considered what might happen if someone stood up to him. And yet, in the span of a few seconds, everything he thought he knew about power had been turned upside down. Dylan, you can't do this. His voice was weak, desperate, the arrogance gone from his tone. I'll tell my dad. But Miss Harris didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply turned her back to him, adjusting her papers on the desk as if she had all the time in the world, as if Dylan's threats didn't matter in the slightest. Dylan's face flushed with anger, but deep down, he knew. He knew that whatever influence his father had, it was nothing compared to the strength and resolve Miss Harris had just demonstrated. There was no money, no connection, no authority that could shield him from what he had just experienced. His pride had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. As the last student exited the room, Miss Harris walked over to the front of the lab, her movements measured, precise. She turned the lock on the door, shutting it with a soft click behind her. The door wasn't just locked for the students. It was locked for Dylan. And as he stood there, still nursing his bruised arm and shattered ego, he realized that his world had changed forever. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but the aftermath of what had just happened lingered in the air like smoke. Dylan Ross stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Miss Harris, who had turned her attention back to her desk, now fully in control. The other students trickled out of the room, some leaving in hushed silence, others glancing back nervously at the scene that had just unfolded. But the silence in the room wasn't just from the absence of voices. It was the silence of realization. The shift in power was undeniable. Dylan Ross, the untouchable bully, was no longer the one in charge. And deep down, he knew it. As the last student left, Miss Harris stood behind her desk, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her calm demeanor, the precision of her every movement, told a story of someone who had lived through much more than anyone in this room could ever comprehend. The students who had witnessed the scene would leave with a story to tell, but they wouldn't understand the full extent of it. No one would. Dylan finally took a step forward, wincing in pain as he reached for his bag, his arm still throbbing from Miss Harris's grip. The humiliation was unbearable. He had been reduced to nothing more than a powerless child in front of everyone, the very people he had once tormented. And the worst part, he had no one to turn to. His father's wealth, his connections, his reputation, they meant nothing now. The damage had already been done. Dylan, I'll make sure you regret this, he muttered under his breath, trying to regain some semblance of his former confidence. But the words didn't come out the way he intended. His voice shook, and even he could tell it lacked the conviction he once carried. Miss Harris didn't react to his threat. She didn't even look up. She simply continued to organize her papers, her focus on the task at hand. Dylan's anger flared, but it was useless. There was nothing he could do to fix what had just happened. The school, the class, the power. It had all shifted in an instant, and Dylan was left on the outside, powerless. But Miss Harris wasn't done. She wasn't interested in revenge. She wasn't interested in making Dylan suffer the way he had made others suffer. What she had just done was simple. She had exposed the truth. Dylan was nothing. He was just a bully, a spoiled rich kid who had never had to face the consequences of his actions. And Miss Harris had shown him what it felt like to be held accountable. But that wasn't where the story ended. That afternoon, the principal's office was flooded with calls. The incident had already spread through the halls like wildfire. Students whispered in hushed tones, recounting every detail of what they had witnessed. The story was everywhere, and Dylan's reputation, the one he had so carefully built, was crumbling before his eyes. Within hours, Miss Harris's actions had been noticed beyond the walls of Westbrook High. Word had spread to the administration, and soon the district office had gotten involved. What had seemed like a typical altercation in the classroom was quickly becoming a matter of serious concern. Miss Harris's handling of the situation, her calm, calculated response to Dylan's violent outburst, had caught the attention of the higher-ups. And it wasn't just because of the incident itself. It was because Miss Harris had done something the system had failed to do for so long. She had held Dylan accountable in a way that no one else had dared to. By the time the district officials arrived to investigate, the school was in a frenzy. Teachers, students, and administrators were all asking the same questions. How could this happen? How had Miss Harris, the quiet, unassuming chemistry teacher, taken down the school's most powerful student without raising a single voice? Dylan, meanwhile, sat in the principal's office, his face pale, his hands trembling as he tried to spin his side of the story. But there was no escaping the truth. He had crossed the line, and now the consequences would come crashing down on him. The next day at Westbrook High was nothing like the usual bustle. The air was thick with whispers and hushed conversations. It wasn't just the students who were talking about the incident in the chemistry lab. Teachers, administrators, even janitors, all had something to say about what had happened. Dylan Ross, the golden boy who seemed untouchable, had been taken down by Miss Naomi Harris, the quiet, mysterious teacher who no one had ever thought to question. But now, everyone was asking the same thing. Who was she really? In the principal's office, Dylan sat slumped in a chair, his face pale and contorted with frustration. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a sense of helplessness he couldn't shake. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. His father's money, his reputation, all of it had meant nothing. Miss Harris hadn't just humiliated him in front of the entire class, she had completely dismantled his power in one swift move. There were no excuses he could make. No amount of influence could erase the truth. The principal, Mrs. Ellsworth, sat behind her desk, her expression stern but not unkind. She had known about Dylan's reputation for years. His father's influence had often shielded him from the consequences of his actions. But this time was different. She glanced at the folder in front of her, containing the statements from the other students, the report from Miss Harris, and the footage from the classroom cameras. She had watched the security footage herself. She had seen Dylan grab Miss Harris by the throat, heard the gasps of the students in the room. It was clear what had happened. And now, the decision she had to make wasn't about whether Dylan was guilty. It was about what to do next. Mrs. Ellsworth, Dylan, you've made some mistakes, but this is different. You're not just being punished for your actions in class. What you did went beyond that. Dylan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was angry. He was scared. But most of all, he was embarrassed. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say, nothing to defend himself with. Meanwhile, Miss Harris was sitting in the staff lounge, her usual calm demeanor intact. She wasn't worried. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. Her actions had been calculated, deliberate. She had known exactly what she was doing. But what no one knew was that Miss Harris's past was far more than what they could have ever imagined. She wasn't just a teacher. She wasn't just someone who had been trained in the art of discipline and control. No, Miss Harris had a history that went back much further than her years at Westbrook High, a history that no one knew about until now. As the district officials sat down with Miss Harris later that day, they asked her the questions everyone wanted answers to. How had she known what to do in that moment? How had she remained so calm when Dylan attacked her? What was her background? Miss Harris simply sat back, her eyes sharp and focused, and told them the truth. Miss Harris, I've dealt with worse. Dylan wasn't the first person to underestimate me. But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to make sure that the people who think they can use their power to intimidate others are held accountable. The officials exchanged glances, and it was clear that they had no idea what Miss Harris was truly capable of. They thought they understood the situation, but they didn't. Not yet. The fallout from Dylan Ross's outburst reverberated through every corner of Westbrook High. The next day, Dylan was summoned to the principal's office. But it wasn't just the principal this time. The district officials had gotten involved. They wanted to know how a seemingly ordinary chemistry teacher had been able to reduce the school's most powerful student, the bully, the untouchable Dylan Ross, to a trembling wreck in front of the entire class. They asked Miss Harris the same question several times, as if trying to piece together a story that didn't make sense. How had she known what to do? How had she stayed so calm? What was her secret? Miss Harris sat in the district office, her calm demeanor never faltering, as if the storm that had just occurred didn't shake her in the slightest. Her eyes, sharp and focused, never wavered from the officials seated across from her. She had seen more dangerous situations in her life than any of them could imagine. And the truth was simple. Miss Naomi Harris was not just a teacher. She was someone who had lived through things that made Dylan Ross's outburst seem like a trivial matter. Miss Harris, it's not about revenge or punishment. It's about ensuring that power doesn't get used to intimidate people anymore. Her voice, steady and deliberate, left no room for doubt. She wasn't interested in talking about the fight that had happened in the classroom. She wasn't concerned about Dylan's consequences either. What she cared about was making sure that the culture of bullying, the unchecked arrogance of students like Dylan, was brought to an end. The district officials exchanged glances. They had expected an answer, but not this one. Miss Harris wasn't asking for special treatment or making excuses. She wasn't interested in sympathy. What they didn't know was that the fight with Dylan wasn't the first time she had been tested. They didn't know about her years of experience, the discipline, the training, the skills she had built over a lifetime. But the real revelation came when the district officials asked her about her background. They were curious. They had heard whispers. There were rumors about Miss Harris's past, about things she had done before teaching at Westbrook High. So, she decided it was time to set the record straight. Miss Harris, before I became a teacher, I served in the military. I've been through things that make high school bullying seem insignificant. The room went quiet. The officials were stunned. They had never imagined that the quiet, reserved teacher had a past like this. But it wasn't just the military service that made Miss Harris formidable. It was the strength of character, the unshakable resolve that came with it. She had learned early on that the world could be cruel, that power could be abused, and that it was up to people like her to step in and make sure justice was served. She had a history of facing danger head-on and never backing down, no matter who stood in her way. Meanwhile, Dylan was at home, his father's lawyers now involved. They had tried to spin the story, tried to downplay what had happened in the chemistry lab, but it was too late. The truth had already spread throughout the school, and it was no longer just about one teacher and one student. It was about a system that had allowed a bully like Dylan to thrive, unchecked, for far too long. His father's money couldn't protect him from what was coming next. The district moved quickly. They held meetings, looked at the security footage, and interviewed the students who had witnessed the incident. The decision was made, and it was swift. Dylan was expelled. His father's influence was powerless in the face of what had happened. He had been caught on camera, choking a teacher in front of a full classroom. There was no defending him now. But Miss Harris's victory wasn't just personal. The impact of what had happened rippled through the entire school system. The district implemented new policies, including mandatory training for teachers on how to handle student aggression and bullying. They added a layer of accountability for administrators who had turned a blind eye to the problems in schools like Westbrook, and it wasn't just at the school level. Miss Harris's actions caught the attention of local media, and soon the story spread beyond the school. People began to talk about the teacher who had stood up to a bully, who had turned the tables and made the system take notice. But even as the reforms started taking shape, Miss Harris didn't gloat. She didn't look for accolades. She had done what needed to be done. The students who had witnessed the confrontation would never forget it. Dylan Ross's humiliation would be remembered for years to come, but more importantly, the lesson he had learned would resonate with everyone who had ever been bullied, ignored, or made to feel powerless. In the end, Miss Harris's strength didn't come from her past in the military or her ability to defend herself physically. It came from her unwavering belief that respect wasn't something you could buy, and it wasn't something you could inherit. It was something you earned, and Dylan Ross had just learned that the hard way. If you've ever seen someone brought down a bully, hit like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, respect is earned, not bought. Do you think Dylan's punishment was fair? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.